Interestingly, the ascendance of Corbyn seems to have coincided with this shift toward alternative media sources, or at least
Mm.
Corbyn supporters would routinely state that they are disillusioned with how the
Mm.
media tends to portray him, or at least they did in the past. There seems to be have been a shift recently, but in the past, especially during the leadership
Yeah.
elections, there was this idea that the media establishment was condescending toward Corbyn supporters,
Mm.
either portraying them as sort of wild-eyed left loonies or just naive,
Yeah.
which pretty remarkably echoes how the Bernie Sanders supporters were treated in the media in the U.S. with
Very
some
similar.
exceptions. For example, Bernie Sanders actually did have the support of, say, maybe the rough equivalent of the New Statesman in the U.S. would be the Nation magazine, and Bernie Sanders was supported by
Yeah.
the Nation magazine pretty unabashedly. Yeah, so that's not a totally neat parallel. But I'm wondering
You're right though. There is
is that a
some
trend? Is that a
crossover.
trend that you? Is there like a synergy there? Is that a trend that you've observed?
Absolutely, and I think you can almost take Corbyn out of it. I think that upset was there before. What you have essentially in UK media, and I'm sure it's partially true for the US as well, is that you essentially have a media and political class that is almost one and the same. So our journalists, are kind of largely white, largely middle class. They went to the same kind of six universities. They graduated 6 inches to the left or the right of each other politically. And this gap between them, it forms this minuscule arena in which all of the media debate about politics, economics, current affairs, the kind of world we can and want to build together happens. So it's this tiny little window. And then you have all of this other stuff, all of these other ideas, all of these other life journeys and experiences that are happening outside of that bubble in Westminster that are simply not represented. And that's really hit crisis point with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, because you had people outside that bubble saying, thank goodness, like someone finally who's in leader of a mainstream political party is actually talking to us, is actually putting his finger on our problems. We can't afford our rent, we can't afford a mortgage. The hospital down the street's closed down. I can't get my kids into a decent school. There's 1.2 million food parcels were handed out in Britain last year. People are literally too poor to eat in large places of our country, and no one was addressing it. And then Jeremy Corbyn won by a landslide. When the whole political establishment basically viewed his nomination as a joke, and was saying, he had bets of 200 to 1 that he was going to win that leadership contest, and he won it by a landslide. Then they held a coup to try and get rid of him, which triggered another leadership election, which he won by an even greater landslide. So at this point, they're really tearing their hair out, and I think by the time it came to the election, they thought they had it. He was all but dead in the water politically. This has not been. This is not as if the media just haven't covered Jeremy Corbyn or have covered him unsympathetically. This has been an relentless character assassination of him that has taken place over the last 18 months, and not just him, but anyone who put their head above the parapet to say they supported him. We had a Labour donor given a full page in the Daily Mail to call Corbyn supporters Nazi stormtroopers. Just the most horrific, accusations being levelled at people. These are just voters who would quite like to vote for someone who says we should share more. Jeremy Corbyn, a winner of the Gandhi Prize in 2013 for his efforts of peacemaking over a 30-year, parliamentary career, and you've got the front page of newspapers saying he's a terrorist-loving communist. So really, just you cannot even imagine the level of abuse he's taken. But throughout that, he has been packing in the crowds. His message has been resonating with people across the country. And throughout the course of this election, even the people that were on the fence, maybe getting a little bit affected by this relentless bashing in the media, are going, hang on, when they're seeing him at the debates and seeing him around in their towns, they're saying, this isn't the guy that's been described to me. I quite like this guy. It's like, this is just seems like a decent man who's speaking to my issues, and his policies are fully costed, and they're promising a significantly better country than the one we've currently got in the next 5 years. So it's an exciting time.
I think on the point of this media culture, which for some reason was structurally hostile toward Corbyn, I think the way that you describe it in the UK is interesting. I think there are aspects of it that are applicable to the US, but I think at the same time the UK environment is even more incestuous and cloistered.
Yeah.
There are elements of that in how the American media functions, but it's so much more dispersed that there are much more avenues for entry, and it's much harder to keep it a cloistered environment, I would say, aside from the most rarefied circles. But that's sort of an ancillary point. One thing that I've been curious about, and I would have read about if American politics wasn't so blindsiding every single day, but there was this Act of Parliament passed in 2011, the Fixed Terms Parliament Act, correct?
Yep.
Which was supposed to standardize the election process in the UK so that it happened on a fixed term every 5 years. And people almost viewed the timing of elections as almost a settled issue and off the table outside the hands of the Prime Minister. But it seemed like Theresa May had no problem whatsoever, just totally flouting that act. So I mean, what happened there mechanically? I just don't understand. Was that just a system failure or something? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think because David Cameron resigned, it gave us the potential to have a new election, because we were saying, well, Theresa May doesn't have a mandate, So originally, many of us were calling for, the time of the Brexit referendum, we were saying we can't just have a referendum. We need to have a general election within 6 months of that referendum. So the parties are saying, this is how we will remain in Europe or Brexit. And you can vote for us in a general election after the referendum to make sure that, the referendum answers, if, and the general election would answer how. So this is if we leave the EU or if we remain, and then you pick a party that will deliver the type of Brexit or the type of remain that you want to see. And we didn't get that. So what we had instead was a whole bunch of different campaign groups through the Brexit referendum that could say whatever the hell they liked in the hopes of winning the vote, which ended up being the Brexit vote. So we're leaving the European Union without a plan. Literally, there is no plan. Theresa May does not have a plan. The EU has a plan. They have all of the negotiators. They've developed their red lines. And we're at sea, really, in this country, wondering what our future is going to look like. So that's that. But remember, in terms of electoral integrity, the Conservative Party is in hot water well beyond fixed term parliaments on that right now. We just had an unprecedented event, which you may have seen about, which is essentially the issue of election expenses fraud that took place by the Conservative Party during the 2015 general election that may well have impacted the outcome. They only won a majority of 12. This was a really narrow victory for the Conservatives and entirely unexpected. They were expected to be defeated.
And one of those seats actually led to the defeat of Nigel Farage, right? He was contesting one of those seats that the Tory who won ended up being accused of, financial improprieties. It
did. Well, it was actually across 20 seats that the election of fraud was alleged to have happened, and our kind of regulator of elections, the Electoral Commission, actually handed down an unprecedented fine. It's the highest fine they can give, which is still pennies to the Conservative Party, but it was £70,000. And our Crown Prosecution Service is now prosecuting. It's charged a sitting Conservative, well, not sitting technically now because we're in a state of flux ahead of the election, but an MP who is trying to become the Conservative MP again in this election.